All right, so we're going to continue our discussion now about the brain. So this is going to be pretty long sections. We're talking about all the different regions of the brain, the different layers, what it does, and there's quite a lot here. So you're going to have to spend a fair amount of time here. The brain is divided into four major regions: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum is the largest portion, which if you look at this diagram here, you can clearly see that it's the largest portion. It does have these deep grooves in it. You don't need to know those names, but just understand that there's these large grooves in it, gives it more surface area. The diencephalon sits between the cerebrum and the midbrain. It's actually kind of tucked inside there. So you can't, it's not external, it's really internal, kind of in the middle of the brain. The cerebellum is the second largest region. It contains more neurons than the rest of the brain combined. When we talk about that, you'll see why. The brainstem makes up the rest of the brain, and it consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. We have this deep groove called the longitudinal fissure, divides the cerebrum into left and right cerebral hemispheres. And we have this thick bundle of nerves called the corpus callosum, and it runs along the bottom of the fissure. It really allows us to have information going back and forth between the left and the right sides of the brain. The brain contains gray and white matter, just like the spinal cord does. The gray matter, which covers the cerebrum and cerebellum in a layer called the cortex, is charged with thought, learning, and reasoning. And these surface folds that I talked about allow more gray matter to be packed into the skull. So that's why it's important that we have these areas. Let's talk about the meninges of the brain. We just in our last lecture talked about the meninges of the spinal cord, and these are exactly the same. So if you remember them for one, you'll be able to remember them for the other. So again, just like we have the vertebrae and the spinal cord that offers some protection, we also have the skull, which offers some protection to the brain. Inside the skull, then we have these three layers: the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. The dura mater consists of two layers here. The outer layer is attached to the inner surface of the skull, and the inner meningeal layer forms the outer covering the brain and continues as the dura mater of the spinal cord. The dura mater separates to create spaces called dural sinuses. These sinuses collect blood that has passed through the brain and is on its way back to the heart. So you don't have to commit that to memory, but just know that that's what that's pointing to here, down into this little space here. A subdural space separates the dura from the arachnoid matter, and a subarachnoid space separates the arachnoid from the pia mater. And the reason why I mentioned that is because ultimately when you talk about head trauma or brain aneurysms or brain bleeding, you'll talk about where that blood is, and you'll find it sometimes in the subdural space or the subarachnoid space, or you'll find it deeper down into the brain. And just to note too that probably everyone's heard of meningitis, and really what meningitis is an inflammation or infection of the meninges. So when you think and you hear about that later on, you'll have to think back to these meninges. There is ventricles in the brain. Okay, so we have lateral ventricles. There's two of them. They arch through the cerebral hemispheres, one in the right and one in the left. Then each of those connects down to a third ventricle, and then a little canal leads to the fourth ventricle. So they're all pretty much connected. And what is occurring here is these are all filled with cerebral spinal fluid. So this animation is going to show you where cerebrospinal fluid moves. Again, I don't need you to know the exact steps of it, but I want you to understand the point of cerebrospinal fluid and what it really does. So it is a clear, colorless fluid. It fills those ventricles we just talked about, and it really bathes the outside of the brain and the spinal cord. The choroid plexus in each lateral ventricle secretes cerebrospinal fluid. So you need to know that. There's this piece called the choroid plexus. It's in each one of those lateral ventricles in the left and right side, and that's what actually secretes the cerebrospinal fluid. And cerebrospinal fluid constantly flows through the central nervous system. It provides nourishment, removes metabolic waste, cushions the brain against minor trauma. So it does have, a lot of good function. So let's watch this animation.
A clear colorless fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, fills 4 chambers in the brain called ventricles. It also fills the central canal of the spinal cord and bathes the surface of the brain and spinal cord. CSF primarily results as the choroid plexus, which is a network of blood vessels lining the floor or wall of each ventricle, separates fluid from blood. The choroid plexus in each lateral ventricle secretes CSF. The CSF flows into the third ventricle, where the choroid plexus adds more fluid. Then CSF flows into the fourth ventricle, where still more CSF is added. Some of the CSF flows through 2 tiny openings called foramina. From there, the CSF flows through the subarachnoid space, up the back of the brain, down the spinal cord, and up the front of the brain. The CSF is reabsorbed into the venous bloodstream by projections of the arachnoid mater into the dural sinuses, called arachnoid villi.
So it makes sense when you see where it's going and what it's doing that its real job there is to provide nourishment to all parts of the central nervous system and also to provide some protection and remove some waste, because ultimately that goes back into the venous system and gets pumped around up to the lungs and the heart to ultimately be excreted via the lungs or via the kidneys. Let's talk about the different pieces of the brain stem. Okay, so we have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain contains tracts that relay sensory and motor impulses. It also contains centers for auditory and visual reflexes, as well as clusters of neurons integral to muscle control. The pons contains tracts that convey signals to and from parts of the brain. Several cranial nerves arrive from this area, which we will talk about later as well. And the medulla oblongata really is the part that we're going to talk most about here, as it number one, it attaches the brain to the spinal cord. It relays sensory and motor signals between the brain and the spinal cord, and it also contains the cardiac center, which is really important because it regulates heart rate. It also contains the vasomotor center, which controls blood vessel diameter and in turn affects blood pressure. And it contains 2 respiratory centers, which regulate breathing. Okay, so if there's damage to this area, people are not going to probably live very long because this really controls a lot of our vital processes. All right, let's talk about the other sections of the brain in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the cerebellum is about the size of a fist. You can see it sits here kind of at the back of the brain, lower piece. Here's the brain stem, okay? So it kind of sits next to it underneath the brain. Like I said before, the cerebellum houses more neurons than the rest of the brain combined, connected to the cerebral cortex by approximately 40 million neurons. The cerebellum receives and processes messages from all over the brain, so it's very, very important. The cerebellum monitors body movements and sends messages for balance, coordination, and posture. It stores the information necessary for muscle groups to work together to perform smooth, efficient, and coordinated movements. And it evaluates sensory input such as touch, spatial perception, and sound. People who have dysfunctions here often have this kind of what we call a spastic gait, poor balance, jerky movements, tremors. They tend to have poor impulse control and overreact emotionally. So you might think about people, if you ever know anybody who has some of those, they're often resulted from a dysfunction in the cerebellum. The diencephalon, which I did say was kind of in the middle there, it's really deep inside the brain, and it consists of several structures, with the chief ones being the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So those are the 2 that I want you to know. The thalamus is shaped like 2 eggs kind of sitting next to each other, and it resides on the top of the brain stem. It acts as a gateway for nearly every sensory impulse traveling to the cerebral cortex. The thalamus processes and filters these impulses, transmitting some, but not all, to the cerebral cortex. It does that job of knowing, do we need to send the signal on or do we not need to send the signal on? Sometimes, have you ever noticed that you can tune out? Maybe if you work already in the medical field, often it's not uncommon that people can tune out the call bell lights or the ringing phones or things like that. That's something that our diencephalon is telling us not to react to. The thalamus also relays messages regarding certain complex movements and is involved in memory and emotion. The hypothalamus is really tiny, but it influences nearly every organ of the body. It controls the autonomic nervous system, which we're going to talk about. It contains centers for hunger, thirst, and temperature regulation. It controls the pituitary gland, which is sometimes referred to as the master gland. And it is involved in multiple emotional responses, including fear, anger, pleasure, and aggression. So even though it's really tiny, it has a huge function inside of our brain. I'll talk quickly about the reticular activating system because you don't need to know the details of this, but it's nice to know that it exists. It's a set of interconnected nuclei. It's scattered throughout the brainstem, and fibers extend from there to the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. What happens here is that the reticular activating system receives sensory input from the eyes and ears, filters out insignificant signals such as routine noises like we were just talking about, and sends impulses to the cerebral cortex so the mind remains conscious and alert. Drugs that depress the reticular activating system induce sleep. So if we want people to sleep, then we give them drugs that suppress this system. All right, the cerebrum, which we talked about as being the largest portion of the brain, is divided into 5 lobes. And you do need to know these, not all 5 of them. I'm not going to require that you know this one here, but I do want you to know the other 4. So they're actually named for the bones over the skull, but I didn't have you learn those either, so that's not going to help you too much unless you did pick those up from readings in chapters previous. The frontal lobe governs voluntary movements, memory, emotion, social judgment, decision-making, reasoning, and aggression. It's also the site of certain aspects of one's personality, right? So we all handle things differently. So that kind of makes sense that, you know, all those voluntary movements and then all of those emotions, memory, judgment, decision-making go hand in hand with our personality. The parietal lobe is concerned with receiving and interpreting bodily sensations, such as touch, temperature, pressure, and pain. It also governs what we call proprioception, which is the awareness of one's body and body parts in space and in relation to each other. So it gives us our idea of where we're located in our environment. The occipital lobe is concerned with analyzing and interpreting visual information. The temporal lobe governs hearing, smelling, learning, memory, emotional behavior, and visual recognition. So it's important that you learn those different areas and kind of commit those to memory. Inside the cerebrum, we need to talk about some structures as well. So we have white matter and we have gray matter here. The bulk of the cerebrum is white matter, which consists of bundles of myelinated nerve fibers called tracts, very similar to what's in the spinal cord in the white matter. Tracts carry impulses from one part of the cerebrum to another, or from the cerebrum to other parts of the brain or spinal cord. Most tracts passing from one hemisphere to the other travel through that structure called the corpus callosum. Okay, so that's just a channel between the left and the right sides of the brain. It allows the brain's hemispheres to really communicate with each other. The surface of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex, and this consists of a thin layer of gray matter. Gray matter makes up about 40% of the brain's mass. And we also, just not on the outside, there's so much of it because of all those deep kind of fissures there. So that's why we mentioned that 40%, because if you just look at it and think it's just a thin outside layer, you might not think that it makes up very much, but it does because of all those deep kind of crevices. But there's also some masses of gray matter within the cerebrum, and they play a role in the controlment of movement. Okay. What happens here actually is where we have the brainstem coming and we have nerve fibers coming in, they actually cross to the left and right side. So this complicates things a little bit because things get a little reversed. But it also allows us to get information to both sides of the brain. So it's really important that that is there. The limbic system is called the emotional brain, and that really consists of the hippocampus and the amygdala. You don't need to memorize these, but I just want you to know that this is where Short-term memory and long-term memory come into play, and where also we can store and recall emotion. So you know what it's like if somebody, a tragic event happens, people probably feel sad. And we can kind of remember this because of this functioning limbic system in our amygdala. Feelings of anger, fear, sexual feelings, sorrow, and pleasure result because of this limbic system. Other parts of the cerebral cortex may also be engaged to ensure those feelings are expressed in a socially acceptable ways. Sometimes people don't, and that's a dysfunction between the limbic system and the rest of the cerebral cortex. So let's talk about sensory functions of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex does have both sensory and motor functions. So here we're going to talk about the sensory function. So sensory nerve fibers transmit signals up through the spinal cord to the thalamus, which then forwards them to the postcentral gyrus. Okay, that's what that's pointing to there. It's a section of the cerebral cortex, right? This is the primary somatic sensory area of the brain. It receives impulses of heat, cold, and touch from receptors all over the body. Because we get signals from the left side of the body and the right side of the gyrus receives signals from the left side of the body, and the left gyrus receives signals from the right side of the body. We have to have this association area here that actually tells us where is that pain, temperature change, pressure, whatever, that sensory stimuli, where is it coming from? So that's just the difference there. So this actually is the sensory area, and then this is the association area that helps us to determine where exactly that sensation is coming from. The motor functions of the cerebral cortex are just located kind of in front of the sensory areas. Okay, so the primary somatic motor area is the precentral gyrus here. So the postcentral was there, and that's sensory. Okay, so this part's sensory, this part's motor here. Okay, so neurons in the motor association area determine which movements are required to perform a specific task and send the appropriate signals to the precentral gyrus. Neurons in this gyrus then send impulses through the motor tracts in the brainstem and spinal cord to the skeletal muscle, and then movements occur. So you look on page 178 in your book, it shows you a little bit, which I think is so interesting, that they've drawn these pictures that show where the precentral and the postcentral gyrus, where it's triggered actually tells our body where it's coming from. So it's kind of cool to just look at those diagrams in your book and be able to see that we've determined this, which has certainly taken a lot of research to be able to do that. Language is something that's really important that happens in our body, and there's a sequence of events that allow us to do things like read out loud. There's multiple aspects of language, though. They include reading, writing, speaking, understanding, and they're all handled by different areas of the brain. So it is a pretty complex process. The two areas that I do want you to know are the Wernicke's area, which is number 3 there, and Broca's area, which is number 4. Okay. Wernicke's area helps people to formulate the words into phrases that comply with learned grammatical rules. Okay, so it actually helps them to kind of understand and form the words. Broca's area plans the muscle movements required of the larynx, tongue, cheeks, and lips to actually form the words, then sends the appropriate impulses to the primary motor cortex. So why I want you to know those is because you might talk, when you talk about diseases of the nervous system, that if people have issues with these areas, it's certainly going to allow them to not be able to speak the words that they want to. So they kind of know what they want to say, but those words can't actually come out. One area is going to be because the stimuli doesn't actually go to the larynx and the other areas that allow us to speak. And one is that the Wernicke's area doesn't actually allow us to put our words together. But both causes are not going to allow someone to speak appropriately. Special senses. I don't want you to know all these different areas, but I do want you to know that they exist. I didn't want to kind of just skip over it, but you do not have to memorize these. But these are all the areas of the brain that are associated with our senses. Vision, hearing, smelling, tasting, all happen in very, very specific and special areas of our brain. Cerebral lateralization, probably most people have heard about, and it's really talking about people who are right brain versus left brain. So in a general sense, people tend to fall one way or the other. And there's tests you can go do online to kind of see where you stand. The left hemisphere is more analytical side. It focuses on language and the types of reasoning used in math and science. The right hemisphere is more concerned with creativity and spatial ability. So we often have people who are very creative, art and music, a great imagination. They're often very emotional. Left hemisphere people are very analytical, logical, concrete, math, and science. I know, because of who I am very, very left brain. It's just how I function. And most people fall one way or the other, but you usually have a combination. The last thing that I want to talk about is the cranial nerves. Okay, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They arise directly from the brain to relay messages to the rest of the body. Each cranial nerve is identified by a name and a Roman numeral. Luckily for you, I'm not going to ask you to memorize all of them and what they do because it is so much information. But know that if you ever do need to know, you'll need to look this information up. So let's just watch the animation on it just so you can get a sense of what they are and what they do, and then that'll complete this section.
Cranial nerves arise from the brain and brain stem through natural openings in the cranium. These nerves supply the head, neck, and trunk. Some bring information to the brain, such as signals from our organs of smell, vision, and taste. Pair 1, the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve controls the sense of smell. Pair 2, the optic nerve. The optic nerve controls vision. Pair 3, the oculomotor nerve. The oculomotor nerve stimulates eyelid movement and pupillary constriction. Pair 4, the trochlear nerve. This nerve directs downward lateral eye movements. Pair 5, the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve manages chewing, the sensation of touch, and facial pain. Pair 6, the abducens nerve. The abducens nerve directs lateral eye movements. Pair 7, the facial nerve. This nerve manages facial expressions, taste, and salivary and tear duct secretions. Pair 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, commonly known as the acoustic nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve controls hearing and balance. Pair 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. This nerve interprets taste and controls some swallowing movements. Pair 10, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve stimulates digestive organs and slows heart rate. Pair 11, the spinal accessory nerve. The accessory nerve controls swallowing and muscles used in head movements. Pair 12, the hypoglossal nerve. The hypoglossal nerve directs tongue movements. Use one of the following mnemonics to remember the order of the cranial nerves. Each word in the mnemonic starts with the same letter of each pair of cranial nerves. On old Olympus's towering tops, a Finn and German viewed some hops. Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, a good vacation seems heavenly. On occasion, our trusty truck acts funny. A great vehicle, says Howard.
I really like the second one there. I think it cracks me up. But again, you don't need to memorize these now. If you ever go on to RN school and have to take anatomy and physiology again through a different program, you will definitely have to memorize them. But for now, currently, you don't need to do that.